I'm Mike Ward, and welcome to Conversations in Healthcare, a video series brought to you by DRG, part of Clarivate. This series examines the healthcare ecosystem and its current business challenges. And in each episode, I'm going to be talking to key leaders and stakeholders in that industry to understand how they're anticipating and navigating certain market dynamics. In this current series, we're actually focusing on COVID-19 and the numerous challenges that the pandemic has actually unleashed on the healthcare industry. So in line with this, I'm delighted to be joined by a special guest, Raymond J. Tesi. RJ is the President, CEO, and the acting CMO of INmune Bio, Inc. It's a publicly quoted immunology company which is headquartered in La Jolla, California, and they're developing treatments that harness the patient's innate immune systems. The company has a number of ongoing clinical trials targeting cancers, Alzheimer's disease, and in the context of this series, they've also just initiated a clinical program that seeks to determine whether its TNF inhibitor can actually prevent complications of cytokine storm caused by COVID-19. So RJ, I hope you and those you care about are doing well and keeping safe. And thanks so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank Mike for having me on your show, and I am delighted to be able to talk about not only the topic of COVID-19, because it's a fascinating topic and a dramatic public health problem, but also, we've lived firsthand this problem of how it's affected our business. In a biotech business like ourselves, there have been a number of pressures on the company, some positive, some negative, and I think our company is a microcosm of both.
Yeah. So actually, before we actually talk specifically about COVID-19, or your COVID-19 trial, could you sort of outline what those sort of challenges and opportunities that this pandemic has caused?
Yeah, so I think they fall into a number of categories. The first thing is, any biotech, particularly a small biotech that like ours that does not have yet a commercial footprint, shall we say, their daily bread is clinical development. We have to be doing clinical trials of testing and developing our drugs in patient populations because that's how we drive science forward, and that's how we drive value for investors. And remember, biotech is about science, but it's business, and I like to say that it's really the business of medicine is what biotech is all about. But in our case, we have programs in cancer, in Alzheimer's disease, and soon in NASH, which is non-alcoholic steatohepatitis, which is a form of end-stage liver disease. And those programs have all become somewhat dislocated by the fact that many of the hospitals have gone into a COVID-only mode in preparation for surges. So they've limited the number of patients that come into the hospital. They've limited clinical trials, et cetera. So in our case, we do a lot of our trials in Australia, and Australia has done a great job of squashing the curve, but they wanted to keep the patients out of the clinic because they were afraid they would catch disease. This was our Alzheimer's trial. As you can imagine, the average age of an Alzheimer's patient is older. I think it's 70 in our trial, and this is a high-risk population. But we have been able to, change our trials a little bit to accommodate this, and we continue to move forward. So that's the hard part. The good part, or shall I say the opportunistic part, and I'll be honest, there's to a lot of biotechs, business opportunities that weren't available 2 months ago have been laid at their feet. And, because we are interested in inflammation and focus on the innate immune system, macrophages, monocytes, NK cells, it turns out that the major complications of COVID-19 are inflammation. And the things that drive that inflammation are macrophages and monocytes. So we are perfectly positioned to actually get involved in the disease. And in fact, we had been kind of, keeping it, wary eye on the whole thing until about a month ago, when 2 or 3 sites that were very familiar with our drug said, "Hey, you've got the right drug to treat the complications of these diseases. Please think about getting involved." We've thrown our hat in the ring and we're up to our elbows in it, and we believe we've done the right thing, and we're moving forward. I mean, I'm working from home, but I've been working as hard as I have ever worked, because we're trying to compress a process that usually takes 6 or 8 months, that is starting a clinical trial, into 6 or 8 weeks. And everybody's stepping up, including the regulatory agencies like the FDA. And it's been a fascinating process, and we think we're going to make a difference.
So before we sort of talk about that particular experience and what you're trying to do, could it just sort of get a little bit granular on? You sort of said, right, okay, with the Alzheimer's trials with those patients, that you had to sort of pivot. Could you sort of explain what you did to sort of minimize the disruption to the trial?
Yeah. So the way the trial is designed is it's a early stage trial. So we're treating a small number of patients, but we study them intensively. And what that means is we see them frequently. And much of that requires coming to the clinic. And so we had to work with the institutions to come up with a strategy that these patients could be safely seen in a way that kind of embargoed them from the COVID-19 risk. So that required, and to the credit of the institutions, they stepped up on this. Their position was, and I'm talking about Australia now, their position was, we're not going to start new trials, but if you have an ongoing trial, we're going to do everything we can to not turn it off. So it required us to make adjustments in how they come in, and also make adjustments in looking at some of the major endpoints. Some of the endpoints are things like MRI scans, which are an imaging process of the brain, and a lumbar puncture, where we're looking at fluid around the spine to look at inflammatory biomarkers. And, we've had to be creative in getting those done. And there have been some delays, but the bottom line is the delays in our case have been at the end of at the part of the trial where, if you're delaying a week or 2 or 3, as long as the patient remains on therapy, it's not problematic. The good news is that although I still can't go to Australia, I mean, if I go to Australia, I have to quarantine myself for 14 days. But they are beginning to open up and, quote, normalize. And I put that in quotes because, as you know, as we reopen any environment, whether it be London where you are, the US where I am, it's not going to be like it was in January. It's going to be an interesting 6 or 7 months as we all work through this.
Yeah. So let's talk about the Immune's look at the COVID itself. You have a TNF alpha inhibitor platform, and inhibition of TNF is associated with a lot of treatments anyway, particularly sort of inflammatory diseases, etc. Could you sort of explain how the platform you have actually differs from the other approaches that are inhibiting TNF?
Yeah, this is a very important question, and it's a question that most people have little knowledge of this difference. As you said, TNF inhibitors have been around, if it's not 20 years, it's certainly more than 15 years, and they have revolutionized the care of patients with autoimmune disease, including rheumatoid arthritis, psoriasis, ankylosing spondylitis, and inflammatory bowel disease. But those, I call them the first generation TNF inhibitors, are what we call non-selective. They block all types of TNF. It turns out there's 2 types of TNFs. There's a soluble TNF, which is the bad TNF. And there's a transmembrane TNF, which is the good TNF. And by good TNF, what I mean is it potentiates the immune response. It promotes brain health by promoting remyelination. Myelin is the insulation around neurons, and it can modify the immune response in a way that allows better response to both infection and cancer. So, in a word, it is not immunosuppressive. The problem with the first generation drugs is they are immunosuppressive. In other words, if you give them, you have an increased risk of cancer, an increased risk of infection, and an increased risk of MS, which is a form of demyelinating neurologic disease. Now, I was a transplant surgeon in my previous life before I joined biotech. I spent years trying to balance this issue when you've got an immunosuppressed patient, because in transplant you give medicines to tamp down the immune system so they accept the organ. And viral infection, life-threatening viral infections, were a big part of that process, that what happened in the early stage of transplant. So I spent years trying to balance immunosuppression with life-threatening viral diseases. And I can tell you, the last thing you want to do when you have someone with a life-threatening viral infection is increase their immunosuppression. You're going to have it's a nightmare. And I think the WHO was first to state this with COVID-19, where over 2 months ago, they made the statement that do not give corticosteroids to patients with COVID-19 because they increase the risk of mortality. And that is because corticosteroids, they're great anti-inflammatories, but they are immunosuppressive, so they make things worse. Our platform, which is dominant negative TNF platform, we call the drug queller for our COVID-19 experience, is a potent anti-inflammatory because it completely neutralizes soluble TNF, the bad TNF, but it completely ignores the good TNF, transmembrane TNF. And as a result, you do not get immunosuppression. And in fact, in animal models, we improve the response to bacterial infections. We improve the response to parasitic infections like malaria. We do not change the response to viral infections. We've studied both equine encephalitis virus and Coxsackie B3. So it is almost tailor-made for a disease like COVID-19, where you don't want to make the viral infection worse by immunosuppressing them, but you want to really take a sledgehammer to the inflammatory process so you can get the disease under control.
Right. Yeah. So that is the sort of the scientific rationale for using your approach, where you can
exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
And I would add two other little quirks. I mean, one of the interesting things about COVID-19 is, as time goes on, we're learning more and more about the disease. You remember 3 months ago when the disease started, everybody was worried about the pulmonary disease and we were going to run out of ventilators. And, you know, there's no question the pulmonary disease is a big deal. But we've kind of figured that out. Turns out we're not going to run out of ventilators. And then suddenly everybody was worried about running out of enough dialysis machines, because it turned out that renal failure was the big problem. And then about a month ago, suddenly the coagulopathy, or the problems with forming abnormal clots, became a big, concern. And that is, some of it was stimulated by a famous Broadway actor, ended up with a young guy, ended up with an amputation due to a complication to an embolus from COVID-19. And then in the last week, suddenly we're now worried about kids who are presenting with this systemic inflammatory syndrome, most likely related to a previous exposure to COVID-19. I mean, to know COVID-19 is to know medicine. I remember when I was in medical school, and which was a while ago, I mean, my professor said, if you know syphilis, you know medicine, because syphilis affected all organ systems. And I can say that's the same with COVID-19. If you know COVID-19, you know medicine, because it affects the brain, it affects the lungs, it affects the livers, it affects the GI tract, affects the kidneys, and affects the cardiovascular system. So it is a very complex disease. And I think that we in biopharma need to kind of back away and say, the lungs are important, but let's really talk about treating the disease of COVID-19, not just the symptoms of COVID-19, which are and the dramatic symptom is the patient who ends up in the ICU intubated with ARDS. So our approach is we've got some very interesting ideas and data about, one of the advantages of targeting soluble TNF, which is the bad TNF. We inhibit the ability of cells to get out of the blood vessel into the tissues where they cause their damage. We have effects on the coagulopathy. So we're really messing with a lot more of the pathology of the disease. And when we get into the clinic, we're going to study all this and see if we can make a difference in patients' lives.
So you mentioned that it was a few weeks back when, some people that you were working with sort of said, hey, maybe, this could be useful for, sort of treating COVID-19 patients. Can you sort of just describe, what that process was like, the sort of discussions and what you then decided what you're going to target? Because clearly there's sort of potential in lots of places. I'm just sort of thinking, in terms of designing a clinical trial with endpoints, you don't want to go for the whole show. You want to be focused. So could you just help us understand what the sort of the thinking was?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm going to answer it in two parts. First, as a public company, this is not about management making decisions. It's about management informing the board of directors and making decisions with, investors in mind. So that's number one. And then we'll talk about choosing the endpoints, because this is a very important process in designing a clinical trial. But what happened to us when these, people we were working with came, contacted us, it happened to be just as we were about to have a board meeting. So basically, I took that information, did a little bit of a deep dive to see if it made sense that we enter a therapeutic trial for COVID-19, and it did. And we had a very, lively discussion with the board of directors, who really gave us the green light. And I will say that, the kind of comments that came out was, look, people are dying. If you can make a difference, let's give it a try. I mean, it was not on our kind of mission pathway, so to speak. But the company was encouraged by the board of investors board of directors who represent the investors to move forward. And I have to say that I think biopharma in general has done a pretty good job in this regard. Some of it's purely opportunistic, because there's a business out there, and some of it is just because we've got the science. Let's see how it works. And so, I think that we in biopharma should get some credit for that. So we made the decision, or we got the green light from the board to move forward. And then the question came to the very important one that you bring up: who are we going to treat? The obvious place to go was to follow the leaders, the people that had gotten an earlier start. And a lot of people at that time were very focused on the pulmonary disease of COVID-19, these patients in the ICU with ARDS. Once again, as someone who spent a lot of time taking care of sick patients, and I can tell you as a professional drug developer, that's a very difficult place to do a clinical trial. So we said, there's a lot of good science and good companies there already trying to make a difference in the patients with ARDS. Where do we have a better chance of being successful? And we became very interested in the group of patients that come into the hospital. In other words, they've come to the ER or come to a clinic. They're symptomatic, and when they're tested with this thing called a pulse ox, which they put on their finger, they actually have evidence of low oxygen in their blood. Their room air saturation is below, let's call it 94% or 93%, which means they've got lung disease. It's actually much more sensitive to do this than to get a chest x-ray or to ask them if they're short of breath. It turns out one of the funny symptoms of COVID-19 is what's been classified these happy hypoxics. These people show up at clinic, they're talking on their cell phone, and they say, "Doc, I don't feel very well." You put this machine on them, and you get a number that's like 70% back, and the alarm bells go off with the clinical teams, because that's like a medical emergency. And the patient's looking around going, "What's the big deal? I feel I don't feel short of breath. So it's one of the interesting little twists of the business. But I got off topic. The bottom line, so we're focused on those patients because 30% of those patients, they get admitted. 30% of those patients are going to crash and burn, end up in the ICU, end up intubated. And at least in New York City, if you got intubated, you over 85% of the time you die. So because that is driven by cytokine storm, of which one of the primary cytokines is soluble TNF, that process of progression of lung disease and shall we say drift into the ICU, we wanted to target those people. And our goal is to keep them out of the ICU. Once they get into the ICU, that's a different battle. It's almost a different disease. The disease I'm treating is the disease of cytokine storm, the disease of preventing the activated immune cells from, one, getting activated, two, getting from the blood vessel to the lung, and three, from causing that coagulopathy. And if I can control that, we can keep the patients out of the ICU, get them home faster. And so that's the patient population we're going after. And we think we made the right choice. I mean, at the end of the day, it depends on, it all depends on what data we get out of the clinical trial. But we like our positioning, we like our drug, and we think we can make a difference.
So the endpoint is going to be something just as simple as keeping people out of going into the ICU?
Yeah, good point. So when we've been obviously talking with the FDA, and I wanted to use what we call a composite endpoint. I wanted kind of a Chinese menu of these catastrophic complications of move to the ICU, intubation, acute renal failure, new onset of neurologic cardiovascular thromboembolic disease or death. And the FDA said, no, you got to pick one. And the one they recommend is the need for mechanical ventilation. So the primary endpoint is going to be the need for mechanical ventilation, but we're going to measure all these other things because, as I said early on, I think one of the one of the mistakes that biopharma has made is in some ways they're still treating the disease of 2 months ago, which was a disease of pulmonary pathology. This is a disease that has a lot of other stuff going on. And I think we need to be more thoughtful, sensitive, insightful, innovative in how we target the pathology of the.
So when do you sort of anticipate being able to start treating patients or running the trial?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So we were actually poised to get started pretty quickly in Australia because we're already running trials there. So setting up a new trial is quite easy. Quite honestly, they don't have a lot of patients in Australia. They have some, and they're expecting a surge associated with their winter. Remember, they're on the opposite seasons of us. But when the FDA came back, and that's just a couple days old, with these recommendations of how they wanted the trial designed, we've kind of slowed things down in Australia because we're going to run the trial as at least we hope to, as an international trial. We're going to enroll patients in both the United States and in
yeah, sure. So as we go forward, beyond the binary, does it work, does it not work? With the sort of the clinical trial, what do you think your biggest challenge is going to be with this program? Is it sort of just getting the patients to enroll?
Good question. I think I tend to be so early on. You remember early on in the COVID-19 thing, a lot of people were like, "Oh, this is going to be another fire drill like SARS or MERS." You remember SARS or MERS, which are first cousins to COVID-19. They came, everybody, a lot of activity occurred, and then they were never heard from again. And so one of the questions we get asked by investors, and actually came up at the board, was, if you start some effort, to go after COVID-19, and in November it's gone and never heard from again, what happens? I mean, you've just wasted a tremendous amount of your scarce resources, both time and treasure. So I think it's pretty, I'm a big fan of Tony Fauci. I mean, it's pretty clear that this thing's not going away right away. We don't know what the shape of those future pandemics, future, parts of the disease will be. But I think there are two parts that are important. First of all, coronavirus is here to stay in one form or the other. After COVID-19, there's going to be a COVID-22. And bet is it won't be the same as this one, but it will have a similar enough pathophysiology. And I can tell you, I hope, next time we'll be more prepared for it. And some of that preparation will be because we have treatments like ours. Remember, we're not an antiviral, so we're not only going to be able to treat COVID-19, we're treating complications of these bad viral infections. So we can plug and play, you name the virus, we'll be able to play a role. The second thing, and this is a promise we made both to our investors and our board, that we would not jump into a COVID-19 effort if we did not see a commercial opportunity that was beyond COVID-19. In other words, if COVID-19 disappeared in November, it's not going to, but if it did, would our efforts be wasted? And it turns out the answer is no. There's a medical condition called cytokine release syndrome and immune-mediated complications, which are related to these new immuno-oncology drugs. The cytokine release syndrome was made famous by CAR T cells. You give the CAR T cells and you get this spectacular fireworks of a cytokine storm that is very symptomatic. And obviously we could use our drug to treat that. The more interesting one to me, and I think the biggest opportunity, is there's a whole series of immune-mediated complications associated with these drugs called immune checkpoint inhibitors. Immune checkpoint inhibitors have revolutionized the care of cancer because they're all about harnessing the patient's T cells, their adaptive immune system, to attack the cancer. Sometimes when they start attacking the cancer, they get a little wild, and you end up with these immune-mediated complications. And it turns out that TNF is a very, or our drug, which is targeting neutralizing soluble TNF, is a perfect solution for treating those. So our approach is that we're gonna be there for COVID-19. We're gonna be there. Hopefully the government sees the value of our program and wants to kind of keep us involved for future pandemics. I hope they don't occur, but I'm a realist. But we do see commercial opportunities that are real, not manufactured, i.e., management of biotechs are very innovative at manufacturing disease opportunities. But these are real disease opportunities, taking care of or treating cytokine release syndrome and immune-mediated complications of checkpoint inhibitor.
Sure. So you mentioned earlier on the fact that there have been sort of regulatory delays. Sort of thinking, as we move forward, and we're in that post-pandemic world, how quickly do you think clinical trials and procedures, etc., that have been put on hold just to deal with the COVID crisis will sort of, be re-triggered, be back on track? And what are you doing to sort of ensure that once you're able to get those green lights, that you're going to be in a position to do so?
Great question. And I think it's first of all, I'm not going to pretend that I have all the answers, but let me tell you what we're thinking about. We are lucky in that we have most of our clinical trial in Alzheimer's disease, our future trials in using MBO3 in breast cancer, and our LiveNate program in NASH are all in Australia, which has, as I mentioned earlier, has done a great job of squashing the curve, and they're opening back up. Now, they were also one of the first ones to shut things down. That's part of the reason they were so effective in squashing the curve. But I think they're going to get back into the business of medicine. Remember, I mean, you've heard this, you're starting to hear this in the US, where there's a much bigger private side to medicine, or shall we say profitable side to medicine, versus a single payer system, the government system like there is in Australia. Hospitals they depend on, elective surgery and all this kind of stuff to make ends meet. And when they had to shut this down and just take on COVID patients, I mean, they performed their public health duty, but they got crushed financially. And so they're going to do everything they can to get back to normalcy. One of the little secrets of clinical development is when you run a clinical trial, the site that's running the clinical trial is charging for that privilege. In other words, there's patient charges, there's hospital charges and all that. So it is a profit center for them. I'm not going to I'm not going to sugarcoat it. And I don't have a problem with it. I mean, because they perform a service, the patients are there, they have to put infrastructure in to support our research efforts. But the bottom line is hospitals have to get back to some normalcy or they're just going to go out of business because they can't afford it. So that normalcy is what, and simply spoken, is elective surgery, because that's where the money is, and clinical development, because that's where the money is. Right, so yeah. I think it won't be straightforward, but it'll happen in due time. I mean, just think about it. I mean, you walk around now, I don't know what it's like in London, but everywhere you go in the United States, people are wearing masks. And initially everybody was kind of nervous about it and shy about it. It's going to become, pretty soon you'll be able to get a Louis Vuitton mask, for Christ's sakes. I mean, that's the way it'll be, right?
Yeah, that's a good point. So finally, so you've identified, sort of the plan to, treat or run a trial with your soluble TNF inhibitor platform in COVID-19 patients. What I mean, it's the beginning of May at the moment. What's the sort of the timeline of news flow? What sort of messages can we expect to hear?
So and you sound like an investor now. I always joke that I have to feed the monster because investors have an insatiable appetite for news flow, and I respect that. It's a practical side of our business. The fact is, some of this is gated by the FDA. I mean, we are in the process of, we've submitted the pre-IND document. We've received their comments. We're in the process of submitting the IND document. I will say, to the credit of the FDA has really taken an all hands on deck approach, that they have really put people from all parts of the agency into the process of supporting the COVID-19 effort. To give you an example, the reviewer that we had for our program is someone from the rheumatology transplant division. Normally, for something that has a pulmonary disease, viral infectious process, it would be viral or a respiratory disease. So they have pulled people in place. They are committing to rapid turnarounds. I think we had a 7-day turnaround of our pre-IND document, which is, really unbelievable. And like I said, hats off to them. Likewise, the hospitals and the hospitals have something called IRB, which is an institutional review board, which is basically an ethics committee. When you go there with a protocol and say, I want to run this clinical trial, it goes through a process where they say, is it justified? Is the science good? Is it ethical and all that? IRB committees, which have a, kind of a casual pace, when it comes to COVID-19, in fact, I've worked with the chairman of the IRB at the Montefiore system in the Bronx of New York City, which was really in the middle of the surge in New York City. And he said that their IRB was turning, protocols, ethics committee, giving ethics committee comments, agreements within 3 or 4 days. So everybody has stepped up. So in our point, I would hope, don't hold me to this, that certainly about within 4 weeks we should be starting our trial. And that's a combination of really, getting the final process done with the FDA and moving through the ethics committee. I think on the outside, it's going to be 8 weeks, but we're aiming for 4 weeks. So it'll probably be somewhere in between. And then, we'll enroll the patients in a way that allow us to capture the data. I have to say, in some ways, I'm almost, I'm really happy for New York that the surge is over. But, going into a place like some of the hospitals in New York that were just completely overrun with patients. I mean, London's probably the same way. That's a hard place to do a clinical trial because there's some bits that you have to do when you're studying these patients that are a little bit over and beyond what traditional, or standard of care is. And I can tell you, having been there in my previous life, when you're back to the wall, you just don't have the time for the research piece because you're just taking care of patients and you're taking care of one. And when you solve that problem, you move to the next one. You don't care about soluble TNF. You just care about getting to the next patient and making a difference.
So I said that was going to be my final question, but there was something there that I'd just like to sort of follow up. So you were sort of recognizing the velocity that regulators and these IRBs, etc., the way that they were mobilizing their resource to focus on this issue. Do you think, in a post-pandemic world that all these various groups will kind of sort of recognize that actually it is possible to work at a faster pace to be able to resolve these issues?
Yeah, your lips to God's ears. I think that's a great question. I think, I think the FDA currently, and I will say the system has always been responsive to urgency and emergency. I mean, and I know the most about the FDA, so let me talk about the FDA. I mean, they've always had these special use INDs, these rapid approval mechanisms where they do work faster. But those tend to be one-offs, and they're not super frequent because usually the magnitude of the problem is smaller. So I think that the systems have always been in place, but what's different now, and that's the same with the IRBs. I mean, if you need a patient-specific IRB for an emergency application, you can get that very quickly at almost any place. But what's different about this is the scale. I mean, this is just huge. And I just don't think any organization can be designed to run at 190% because it just won't happen. Mistakes will be made. At the end of the day, the FDA, and I think they do a great job, is all about safety. Is it safe? Is it safe? Is it safe? Oh, by the way, does it work? Right? I mean, that's what they're about. When patients are dying, they worry more about efficacy than safety. But at the end of the day, we want them to worry about safety. And I think things will change. You're going to see more telemedicine. You're going to see more monitoring visits that don't have to be face-to-face. There will be changes, but you're not going to see, it's not going to go like this forever because it's just, first of all, it can't. People will burn out. Secondly, at the end of the day, for a lot of diseases, I mean, if you're I don't want to pick on asthma. If you're the 17th drug coming in for asthma, there's no emergency there because there's 16 other choices, right? So, I think they've got the balance right. So, it works. It works.
So, RJ, thanks very much for taking the time to speak to us today. I genuinely wish you and your company success because, what you're doing is potentially a solution to a critical problem at this time, and also grateful for the sort of the insights and the stories that you've actually shared because I'm sure they're going to be very useful. They're going to resonate with other business leaders in the healthcare sector. So thanks for that. If after listening to this broadcast you've got questions for either me or RJ, please click the link, which is at the end of the video. And also, we would love to hear from you. So, please give us your feedback because that will obviously help shape the kind of content that we are developing going forward. Also, if you'd actually like to sort of tune into future episodes, follow our LinkedIn page, because we'll be posting alerts to when those releases are going to be put out. So in closing, I'd like to thank RJ again. Thanks very much for joining us. I'd like to thank the listeners for also tuning in. And also, on behalf of myself, DRG, and Clarivate, we'd also like to thank all those in the healthcare system who are working incredibly hard to find a solution to this problem. The work that you do is absolutely critical, and won't be forgotten. So we're all indebted to you. So until next time, stay safe and healthy. I'm Mike Ward, and I hope to see you in the next episode.